Hello, it's Alex and welcome to Hey Little Thrifter. Today I'm going to be talking about all of the books I read in November. I took part in 3 readathons this month. There was Non-Fiction November, hosted by abookolive. There was the 5 Decades of Horror Challenge, hosted by Written in Blood, and Evil-a-thon, hosted by Kasha in Bookland. I will leave all of their channels linked below, so definitely do go check them out if you haven't already. First up, I read Black Ambrosia by Elizabeth Engstrom. This is a vampire novel and I do have a separate review video for this, so I'll leave that linked below if you want to go watch it. I rated this one 4 stars out of 5. It's an excellent read, she's a great writer, and this was a really unique and interesting vampire story. Next up, I read The Other by Thomas Tryon, and I read this as a buddy read with the lovely Julie over at A Girl and a Book. We both really enjoyed this and I think we both rated it 4 stars. And I'm really glad I got a chance to buddy read something with Julie. We had a really good time discussing this and yeah, it's a great book. It's about twin boys, Niles and Holland. Niles is like the good one and Holland is the troublemaker. He plays a lot of mean pranks and they turn deadly in nature. This is really well written, I really enjoy his writing. There are a couple of characters in here, the mother and grandmother, that I especially liked. I really enjoyed reading about them, and the story is kind of a quiet, slow burn, but then there are these moments of like brutal horror interspersed throughout there which kind of knock you off your feet. And yeah, I thought it was really well done, very effective, and the story does kind of take a couple of meandering turns where I just wanted it to get back to the main story, but it's still a really excellent read, definitely one that I would recommend you pick up. Next up, I read The Dead Girls Club by Damien and Angelica Walters. This is a new release and I got an advance copy through NetGalley. This is a thriller, and admittedly when I requested this from NetGalley I was hoping it was one of those thrillers that was really more horror, but they were just marketing it as a thriller because that's more popular. But it is pretty much a straight thriller, and I had heard that before I did dive into it, so I'm glad I knew that going into it because I would have been disappointed otherwise. The reason I hoped this might be more horror leaning is that I'd read her short story collection Cry Your Way Home, which I really enjoyed, and that had a lot of horror, fantasy, speculative fiction themes in there and really well written, and so I was hoping that there might be some of that in The Dead Girls Club. It's about a woman in her 30s called Heather. When she was younger, around 12 years old, she and her friends had what they called the Dead Girls Club, where they would talk about ghosts and serial killers and all things spooky. And now in the present day, something that happened during that time comes back to haunt Heather, and she has to figure out exactly what's going on. And I thought this was okay. I rated it 3 stars. It had its moments and I did find it to be quite a compelling read, but there were times I felt it was quite drawn out and repetitive, and there was a lot of talk of sweaty palms. If you took a shot every time sweaty palms were mentioned, you probably wouldn't still be standing by the end of the book. I did like the format of the book. It's told alternating then and now chapters, so we got to know this group of young girls and their friendship and this red lady story that one of the girls tells, and that becomes a big part of their friendship group, and the now chapters while Heather is trying to figure out exactly what happened back then. I must admit I was quite disappointed in that it did feel just like a pretty generic thriller, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but after reading her short stories I was expecting something more, just something a bit more interesting and different rather than kind of a run-of-the-mill thriller. There were definitely quite a lot of thriller tropes in here, so I wasn't really a huge fan of that, but it was still a decent read, so if the premise sounds interesting to you, then you might still want to check it out. Then I read Monster, She Wrote, The Women Who Pioneered Horror and Speculative Fiction by Lisa Kroger and Melanie R. Anderson. This is a non-fiction book all about what it says on the cover, and it's a really excellent read. I really enjoyed it. I do have a separate review video for this book if you want to check that out and hear more of my thoughts about it. But yeah, it's definitely worth picking up if you are interested in this topic, and I definitely added a bunch of books and authors to my TBR after reading it. I rated this one 4 stars. Next I read The Man in the Picture by Susan Hill. This is about a mysterious painting of a Venetian carnival scene, and it seems to have a dark past, and anyone that comes into contact with the painting is maybe at risk of something bad happening to them. I really enjoyed this one. Her writing is great. We get parts of the story told by different characters, which I really liked, and it's told in that classic ghost story style, so it's very atmospheric and creepy with like an underlying sense of dread. So yeah, it ticks a lot of boxes for sure. I don't want to spoil the ending, but I was a bit disappointed with how it ends, just in comparison to how great the rest of the story was and how much I was enjoying it. I didn't feel the ending quite lived up to the rest of the story. I would still recommend it though, because overall it was a very atmospheric read, and I rated it 3.5 stars. Next up I read The Marberry Lens by Andrew Smith, and this was another buddy read I did this month, this one with the lovely Emily over at Page Turns, and she had heard about this book recently. I think she'd read an article about how gruesome the content in this book is, so we were intrigued and we decided to pick it up and read it together. It's a YA novel, and I think it would be classed as fantasy, although it is kind of hard to categorise. But this is about a teenage boy called Jack. He goes to a party with his friends one night, gets drunk, and on his way home he gets kidnapped by a man who keeps him tied up in his home with the intention of raping him. So yeah, it definitely starts off with not your typical YA fare. Jack does manage to escape. This all happens really early on in the book, and a few other things happen, and he ends up finding this strange pair of glasses, and whenever he wears them he is transported to this other world that's like some kind of dystopian Mad Max style situation. So Jack goes back and forth between the kind of the real world and this place called Marbury, and as the story goes on he becomes more and more obsessed with Marbury and spending time there and with the people he has met there. In the real world, as this is going on, he meets a girl and there's this kind of insta-love romance going on. Both Emily and I had the same feelings about this book. It is confusing and convoluted and overall a very frustrating read. It starts off pretty promising. It was quite engaging and easy to read, and the problem was, as the story goes on, every kind of idea, every like speculation that we had on where the story might be going, or you know what this thing might mean, just by the end of it nothing meant anything. It was just all kind of pointless. It had potential because some of the things we thought it was about were really interesting and yeah, quite heavy topics, but it just didn't feel like anything went anywhere and it got quite repetitive. And another thing that we both really disliked was the fact that Jack's best friend in the book is constantly making homophobic jokes aimed at Jack, and we were hoping that this would have some kind of meaning or, you know, point to it, some kind of redemption by the end of the book, but it didn't. So it was just like a string of homophobic comments for no reason. And there was also a comment about how most girls are sluts, which also was not redeemed. So yeah, it was a very odd book, definitely not one that I could recommend to anyone, and I rated it 2 stars. It does have a sequel, but no, I'm done. Next up, I read Darkscope by Margaret Falk. This is a kind of supernatural mystery with horror elements. It is classed as horror on the spine, but I'm not sure I would really put it like full on in horror. I think if you like your horror on the lighter side, or if you are a fan of mysteries with like a supernatural element, then yeah, I think this would be a good one to check out. I did enjoy it overall, even though it was a bit different to what I expected. It's about a woman called Chelsea who is going through a divorce, and she moves back to her hometown. This is like an old mining town where her great-grandfather made all of his money. And in the house that she moves into, she finds this old box camera, and some strange things happen, and she is haunted by this woman who died many years ago, and Chelsea has to figure out exactly what happened to her. There is also a historical element to the book, and we get sections told from decades previously, detailing things that have happened and how that is now kind of affecting the things going on in the present day. So that was all like 1920s and 30s kind of era. So if you like historical fiction as well, or you like other stories with a historical twist, then you might like this one too. It was a bit of a slow start for me to get into this one, but I am glad I stuck with it. It was an enjoyable read overall, and there are some really good horror moments and scenes in here, and I thought they were really well written, so she can definitely write horror. It's just, I think I wanted more of that kind of writing, whereas the rest of the story is a bit more of a mystery. I rated this one 3 stars. Next up, I read The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. This was on my 5 non-horror novels I must read this year, and I've ended up leaving most of them till the end of the year. This is a super famous book, so I won't go into too much detail, but it was a bit of a mixed experience for me. I found there were times when I was really captivated by her writing and I could really feel for the character, but then there were other times when it honestly felt quite boring and self-indulgent, and I kind of feel bad for saying that because it is partly autobiographical, but so it goes. That was my experience with it, and there were times when I was going to put it down and not keep going, and I am glad I read the whole thing. It definitely has a lot to praise in here, but overall the experience was a mixed one for me, so I rated this one 3 stars. Then I read The Nightwalker by Thomas Tessier. This is a werewolf novel, and it's about a man in his 20s called Bobby. He is an American, but now he's living in London and he has a girlfriend, and you know, life is okay. But he starts to experience these headaches, and he's getting these strange feelings in his hands and feet, and the doctor just explains it away as being migraines, but he knows something more is going on, and he starts to experience these moments where he is having these strong urges to do things to people. So yeah, without going into too much detail, this was a good read, and overall I did enjoy it. It isn't a very long book, it's less than 200 pages, but even so I did feel it was a little slow at times, and there are quite a lot of interesting elements to the story, and overall I think it worked, but there were times when, because they were so different, it made the story feel kind of fragmented. So there are some interesting things like voodoo and werewolves, and there is a clairvoyant character, and it touches on the Vietnam War and also the punk scene in London. So yeah, it's got a lot of interesting things going on for sure, and Some of my favourite parts were, funnily enough, the sex and violence. Not necessarily because they were sex and violence, but I just thought those scenes were especially well written and really effective. And I rated this one 3 stars. Then I read, or at least started to read, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Kesey. This is another absolute classic, one that I've been meaning to read for years, and it was also on my must read this year list, and I got about a third of the way into it and I decided to put it down and DNF it. Who knows, maybe I'll pick it up another time, but I just wasn't feeling it. Even within this first third, I thought it was quite drawn out and repetitive, and every time I picked it up I just did so with a kind of feeling of not wanting to do it. I wasn't drawn to it, I wasn't enjoying it, and I kind of hummed and hawed about whether to keep going, and I just thought, you know what, if I'm not feeling it, I'm not feeling it, so I'm just going to put it down and write it off. And I know this is well loved by many, but it just wasn't doing it for me. It's not that the writing was bad, the writing was actually really great, and there were definitely some moments that I thoroughly enjoyed, but overall it wasn't grabbing me. And lastly, I read This Is Midnight, a collection of short stories by Bernard Taylor. He's one of my favourite authors, so I was really looking forward to checking this out, and I listened to the audiobook version, which is narrated by David McClelland, and I thought he did a really good job. I enjoyed his delivery. So this is a collection of short stories, and a lot of them touch on family related issues. Not all of them, but quite a number of them do. A lot of them are kind of seemingly everyday scenarios, and then right at the end something horrific happens. Some of them definitely have something a bit different and unique going on, and overall this was an enjoyable collection. I think my favourite story was one towards the end called Travelling Light, which is about a man who arrives at a hotel he's booked a room at, and there's been some kind of mix-up and his room isn't available, but there's another chap there who says, oh, I've got a room that has an extra bed in it, if you want to stay there for the night, that's totally fine. And yeah, I won't say too much more about that one, but it was a really great story, actually quite a short one, but I thought the ideas there were really interesting, and yeah, could have totally been made into a novel. I feel it was that interesting a premise. Some of them were a bit more light-hearted, and then other ones were a bit more like, whoa, brutal. So yeah, it had a really good mix in that respect. Overall, I enjoyed this collection and I rated it 3.5 stars. So those were all of the books I read in November. Let me know if you read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought, or let me know what your favourite book that you've read recently was. Thank you ever so much for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I will see you again in my next video. Bye!